Hello, and welcome to this episode of Epochs, where I shall be talking all about the decline and fall of the Roman Republic. Now, let me take you to a moment in time. Just shy of 140 years before Christ, a young Roman aristocrat was making his way through Italy on his way to fight a war in Spain. And what he saw out of his carriage window set in train a series of events which were to define his life and career and ultimately lead to the end of the Roman Republic itself about 100 years later. What that young Roman aristocrat, just starting out on his career, saw was that where Italy should have been filled with small homesteads, small farms, it was in fact filled with giant farms held by just a small number of extremely rich people. And instead of working those farms were good, hard-working, honest Italian people, he saw foreign slaves. And what it meant was that the very fabric of Roman or Italian society was all out of whack, that there was something terribly wrong at the heart of Roman society. And it affected that young aristocrat very profoundly. And he went on after his military career to have a political career in Rome. And he tried to champion the causes of the downtrodden and the poor and the dispossessed. And I want to tell you his story, because his story is really one of the first, most important stories when it comes to the grand narrative of the fall of the Roman Republic. And that young aristocrat's name was Tiberius Gracchus. So when talking all about the life and career and achievements, or lack thereof, of Tiberius Gracchus, you'll be looking at Appian and Plutarch. I'm mainly going to be reading from Plutarch. So to begin the life of Tiberius Gracchus, the first thing you've got to say really is that he is extremely blue-blooded. He wasn't just a bit aristocratic, he was kind of as aristocratic as you could get, in a way. His father, another Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, had been a censor and a consul twice, i.e. the very, very pinnacle of Roman political life. His father had enjoyed 2 triumphs. Again, quite remarkable. It means you've really, really hit the absolute pinnacle of political achievement in Rome. His father was an extremely important person. And his mother was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the Scipio Africanus. So on both sides of his family, sort of a great heritage, great lineage. And his mother Cornelia had in total had, I think, 12 children, but only 3 lived to adulthood. He had Tiberius himself, and he had 1 sister, and he had 1 younger brother, Gaius. That's terrible, isn't it? Such a high infant mortality rate in the ancient world. Unbelievably high, really. And Tiberius Gracchus' father had died when Tiberius was still quite young, and the whole estate was left to his mother. Now, she must have been an extremely formidable woman to raise such men as Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. But also, we know that she just took control of the family and the estate and managed it extremely well. At one point, she turned down the offer of marriage from the king of Egypt. It was Ptolemy VI. He wanted to marry her, and she said, "No thanks, I'm happy to remain a widow in Rome." So extremely strong-willed. Must have been, as I say, a formidable woman. Now in Plutarch, his lives, the biographies he writes, are quite often comparisons. He might compare Julius Caesar and Alexander, for example. But in the case of the Gracchi brothers, he actually compares the 2 brothers with each other, whose political careers were about 9-10 years apart. Tiberius was about 9-10 years older, and thus their careers are separated by about the same distance. And he compares them together because in many ways they're very similar, and in other ways they're polar opposites to each other. And I'll talk, I think next episode of Epochs, I'll talk to you all about the career of Gaius Gracchus. But for this one, I just want to concentrate on Tiberius Gracchus. And we're told that he had lots of courage, physical, personal courage, self-discipline, generosity, eloquence and idealism. But when he spoke, and in his interpersonal dealings with people, he was very gentle and composed, and he spoke with decorum. which is very different to his brother Gaius, who's sort of very passionate and hot-blooded. And Tiberius's politics as well. We're told that they were the type of politics he liked to practice could be characterised as conciliatory, and that he liked to appeal to people's sort of sense of honour or pity. He didn't try and sort of browbeat people or bully people into seeing things his way. He tried to actually convince them or pull on their heartstrings. Again, different to his younger brother, which again I'll talk about next time. Plutarch talks of him as mild and reasonable, and that he was very brave in the face of the enemy, because as a lot of all Roman statesmen really in Republic days, before you could really start a political career in Rome, you had to have a military career, and Tiberius Gracchus did. And in the face of the enemy, apparently he showed bravery and resolve, and in his dealings with any sort of subjugated people, justice was first and foremost in his mind, apparently. He had a, quote, scrupulous attention to his public duties and a restraint in indulging in the various pleasures of life, whether that be the table or women's or games or whatever it was. He showed restraint. So, overall, he's supposed to have, a good, solid character, a good sort of virtuous character. There's not much that Plutarch finds to criticise him for. The only things he does say is that he was maybe a touch vain, not even really vain, just a little bit vain. Like he paid attention to fashion, how men would wear their hair, or the sort of the cut of their toga. Tiberius Gracchus liked to be quite fashionable, and there's nothing really wrong with that at all. It's not necessarily a vice at all. But if you were going to count it among the vices, Tiberius Gracchus was guilty of it in a very small sense. The other things is apparently he did like to spend money, again, a little bit, not massively. He didn't cover himself in gold and jewels and silver. Again, Plutarch says one story of that he bought some dolphins that were made of silver and that they were really expensive. That's like one of the only things Plutarch can think to criticise him for. So again, in the whole scheme of a life, it's really not that bad at all, is it? So where Tiberius Gracchus, as I said, came from a really important family. Both sides, maternal and paternal, of his family were extremely important, and that again, from the earliest age, was sort of singled out as having a good character. He was given a priesthood in the College of Augurs. There were only 9 augurs, a type of religious office, and he was enrolled into that. So people must have held him in high esteem, no matter sort of how good your family are and how sort of clean and good your personality is. If you don't kind of deserve one of those priesthoods, you probably wouldn't have got one in the 150s BC. You had to actually be worthy of it, at least a bit. Again, it speaks volumes about his character. And during his initiation ceremony for that priesthood, an extremely important man, Appius Claudius, offered him, Tiberius Gracchus, his daughter, Claudia, in marriage. Now, Appius Claudius, sort of the head of the Claudian household, and they really are the creme de la creme. They really are, you could argue, the preeminent family of middle to late Republican Rome. To be married into the Claudian family, you just couldn't marry any better than that. It's the highest level, really. And there's a nice anecdote that when Appius Claudius returned home that evening, he shouted to his own wife that, bring our daughter, bring Claudia down. I want to announce to her that I've betrothed her in marriage. She is now affianced. And his wife is supposed to have been a bit shocked and said, what's all the hurry? Why so suddenly? Unless you've got Tiberius Gracchus to marry her. And of course, that is the story. So once again, speaks volumes that even the Claudians were happy to have Tiberius Gracchus marry into their family. And so soon enough, Tiberius Gracchus keeps moving up the ladder, the cursus honorum, and becomes a military tribune. And a military tribune is quite a high rank in the Roman army. It's above any sort of centurion, but it's a low, sort of relatively starting rank for a member of the aristocracy who's being groomed to perhaps one day have a very high profile statesman level political and military career. So being a military tribune is both extremely important and a high rank, but also starting on the rungs of what would hopefully be an extremely eminent military career. So as military tribune, Tiberius Gracchus goes out and fights in the Third Punic War in North Africa, in Carthage. That's where Scipio Africanus the Younger, not to be confused with the Scipio Africanus, quite often instead of being called Scipio Africanus the Younger, he's called Scipio Aemilianus. He goes and fights under him. He's the commander, he's the CO on the ground. There's even a line that Plutarch tells us that Tiberius Gracchus scales a wall and goes over a wall first. It's not made explicitly clear whether it's the wall of Carthage during the final sack of Carthage. But here's what Plutarch tells us. He says, quote, Tiberius soon came to surpass all the young Romans of his age in discipline and courage. Indeed, he was the first to scale the enemy's wall, according to Fannius, who writes that he himself climbed up with Tiberius and shared in the exploit. Tiberius won the affections of many of his comrades while he was with the army and was greatly missed when he returned to Italy. End quote. And after that first taste of military exploits, Tiberius Gracchus returns to Rome and is elected quaestor, so again, moving up the ranks, the political ranks. And it's soon after that that he gets another, what we might call a commission, another set of orders to go and fight, again, as a military tribune in a foreign war, this time in Spain, the Numantine War, the Celtibrians. And this time his commander, his CO, is a guy called Mancinius. And we're told that Tiberius Gracchus distinguished himself once again, that, quote, courage and intelligence shone out of him all the more brightly. Seems like Tiberius Gracchus quite liked the military life. One of those people that accepted the danger and the risk. Instead of the fear and responsibility crushing you, it sort of elevates you to higher levels, sort of makes you perform even better than you otherwise would. All the accounts say that Tiberius, again, he shone as a military tribune. But his commander, Mancinius, is said to have been extremely unlucky. That he wasn't necessarily a terrible general, he obviously wasn't great, but he wasn't really, really terrible. And he didn't make loads and loads of absolutely ridiculous blunders, but he did find himself reversed by the Celtibrians and the Numantine armies. And he finds himself having to run away, basically losing a battle, or at least being bested on the field, and having to flee, having to order his whole army to sort of retreat in order to make sure they're not completely wiped out in a rout. But still, that's quite dishonourable. That's still a fail. That's still an L that he has to absorb there. And here's where there's an episode where Tiberius Gracchus first really properly distinguishes himself, where all of Rome would have got to hear of this sort of famous event that plays out next. The Numantine army wants to completely annihilate the Roman army. There's something like 20,000 Roman soldiers that have essentially capitulated. And Maecenas sends word that he'd like to negotiate some sort of peace, some sort of treaty that allows his remaining 20,000 men to get out alive. And he just refuses to really treat with the Romans and Maecenas at all, until they get word that the tribune Tiberius Gracchus is prepared to negotiate with them. And at that, the Numantines say, okay, we knew his father, we had a great amount of respect for the old Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, and we know this new kid. Everyone knows his character, his personality, that he's sort of beyond reproach, that he's good, that he's trustworthy, if nothing else. So, okay, all right, we'll open up negotiations if you send us Tiberius Gracchus. And so they do. And Tiberius Gracchus, we're told that in the negotiations, the Numantines sort of get some concessions out of him, but he gets some concessions out of them. And anyway, the long and short of it is that Tiberius Gracchus is able to negotiate for the release of about 20,000 Roman soldiers, that those men all get to go home and see their families again, rather than being butchered to a man. So that's sort of a great boon. You know, that's a real win, isn't it? Well, you would think so. When word gets back to Rome, all the hardliners, all the hawks in the Senate, they just view the whole episode as disgraceful. One, that Maecenas found himself pushed off the field of battle, and then that the Romans didn't fight to the last man, and that even Tiberius Gracchus, what he did, those negotiations, that wasn't a great win. It was sort of dishonourable in some ways. Well, you can look at it either way, couldn't you? But nonetheless, probably one of the most powerful men in Rome in terms of gravitas, autoritas, in terms of just authority, was still Scipio Aemilianus, who was a dear friend of Tiberius Gracchus. And he sort of stood up for him in the court of public opinion and said, no, look, come on. Okay, those guys over there in Spain may have dropped the ball by not just winning the battle in the first place. But come on, don't stain Tiberius Gracchus with negotiating to save 20,000 of our countrymen's lives. Come on, that isn't disgraceful. Come on, that was the right thing to do, surely. And so Tiberius Gracchus, it seems, sort of just about avoids his reputation being completely tarnished. And most people, in the end, agreed that he'd done a great thing. And it's very soon after that sort of reverse and defeat in Spain that Tiberius Gracchus comes back to Rome, and his great friend and benefactor, and probably the most famous Roman alive at that point, Scipio Africanus the Younger, Aemilianus, he's sent to Spain to sort of finish up. So any sort of political cover or friendship Tiberius Gracchus would have enjoyed from Scipio the Younger in Rome, he hasn't got, because he's been dispatched to Spain. So Tiberius Gracchus comes back to Rome, and Scipio goes to Spain. And it's in the following year, the year 133 BC, that all the main events of Tiberius Gracchus play out. It's sort of quite a quick episode, really, all over that 1 year, the year 133, sort of a pivotal year. Most historians look back on it, even ancient historians at the time, people like Appian and Plutarch, look back on that year and say, you know, that was the year when things really started to fall apart, when the first massive, you know, very real, undeniable cracks in the Roman Republic become apparent, and no one can deny them. And Tiberius Gracchus is on a collision course with his own fate. Plutarch says that, quote, "In my opinion, Tiberius would never have suffered the fate which finally overtook him if Scipio had been in Rome at the time of his political campaign." Because in the year 133, Tiberius Gracchus wants to keep moving up the ladder of honours in the Roman system. And the next one would be to become a tribune of the people. Well, it's not necessarily the next one. It's not sort of necessarily a linear thing. Arguably, the next greatest office of state after Quaestor would be a praetor. Some people have said that Tiberius Gracchus deciding to try and run for office to be a tribune of the people, which is very different to a military tribune, is a little bit odd. Because a tribune of the people wouldn't necessarily, or quite often wouldn't have been, an aristocratic blue-blooded person. So if I can describe a little bit about the nature of a tribune of the plebs, a tribune of the people. Back in the 700s BC, Rome had had kings. Tarquin was the last one. Tarquinius Superbus was the last of a string of kings that Rome had had. And in the end, those kings became too tyrannical, and the people overthrew them, and the Republic started in the 700s BC. Then in the 400s BC, it seemed like the patrician class had overstepped their mark and had been too repressive towards the normal people, the plebs. And a new constitution, a new constitutional agreement was sort of hashed out in roughly in the 400s BC. And it was at that point that the plebs insisted, in return for fighting in the wars, the various wars of expansion in Italy, they extracted from the patrician class various political concessions. One of which was that there should be some checks and balances on the Senate. The Senate shouldn't be allowed to act as complete tyrants. So what they'd put in place is they'd have the tribunes of the people, 10 of them. Sometimes that number fluctuated a bit, but usually 10 tribunes. And tribunes were supposed to have the power to put forward laws in and of themselves, which they very, very rarely chose to do, but mainly have the power of veto. That if the Senate had asked the people for too much, or if they were asking too much of them, go and fight endlessly in wars until you're all dead, say, the tribunes could say no, we're just vetoing that. But it had been the custom for a few hundred years, roughly from the 400s down to sort of the 130s, it had been the custom that the tribunes would very, very rarely use their veto power. We're told a number of times all over the place that there was just sort of this delicate balance of power, that the Senate were afraid of the people. They were afraid of the tribunes, the power of the tribunes. They knew not to push their luck too far, because in the end the mob would come and get them and kill them all, perhaps even in their own homes. But the people and the tribunes were wary of the Senate because they knew that they sort of really needed their goodwill, and their positions were venerable, and the whole system did work well if the cockpit of power largely rested with that body. And so there was, for a few hundred years, there was sort of an equilibrium, if we believe the sources, between the people and the aristocracy, between the Senate and the assembly, the popular assembly. A lot of people might not know that there was another big body, the popular assembly of the people. We also need to touch on how these things were voted for, the assembly. All the citizens in Rome that were eligible to vote were split up into tribes, what they were called tribes. And there were lots of these tribes, dozens and dozens of these so-called tribes, or you might think of them as voting blocks. And they would vote for who got to be in the popular assembly. Now, there was lots of corruption. It got sort of crazily, stupidly, absurdly out of hand in the few generations after this, where whole tribes, whole voting blocks could be bought and sold for vast sums of money. During the age of Caesar and Pompey and Crassus, the level of corruption got to extraordinary and extremely open lengths. But still in this time, the different tribes of voters were still important in making up who got to sit in the popular assembly, and then by extension who got to nominate and vote in the tribunes of the people. But anyway, as you can imagine, there was always some sort of tension or antagonism between this popular assembly and the Senate. Nearly always their motivations and goals and agendas are very different. The Senate are sort of land-owning aristocratic class of people, and the assembly are much more interested in the concerns and plight of the average person, the plebs, the urban plebs. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there were all sorts of problems by the 130s BC. There were all sorts of problems that had been festering away for quite a while in Roman society. One of the big ones was whether the wider Italian people should have citizenship. In other words, whether they should be allowed to enjoy the spoils of empire. Rome, in quite short order, had gone from one of the great powers of the Mediterranean to suddenly the great superpower of the Mediterranean. They'd gone from sort of hegemons of Italy to the undisputed masters of the vast majority of the known world after defeating Carthage and finally wiping out Carthage, in the Third Punic War. So within a few generations, there was a fantastic amount of money and slaves pouring into Rome and Italy. And a lot of the Italian allies, as they get called a lot, wanted to share the wealth. And Rome, the aristocratic landed class of Rome, the senatorial class, didn't want to share all that money and influence and power and slaves. And how land was distributed and who owned the land was really important. Some people, a particular class in Rome, was becoming so rich that they could just buy up all the farms, nearly all the farms in Italy, and dispossess people who it really should have been theirs by right, and then even push them off of their own land, or what should have by rights be their own land, and replace them with some foreign slaves. And it was just an injustice. It was just unfair, but it was happening on a giant scale. Now, the picture I tried to paint for you right at the top of this episode was that. And I can't really emphasise how big a deal it was. I mean, in a generation or so after Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, there's a whole war about it, where about 300,000 people die. There's a giant war over just this issue. But it starts here, and it's really important to the career of Tiberius Gracchus. His whole time on the stage of history and politics in Rome is completely bound up in this issue. And so I'll let Plutarch describe it, because of course he knew best, and he puts it very succinctly, like this. Quote, "Whenever the Romans annexed land from their neighbours as a result of their wars, it was their custom to put a part of it up for sale by auction. The rest was made common land and was distributed among the poorest and most needy of the citizens, who were allowed to cultivate it on payment of a small rent to the public treasury. When the rich began to outbid and drive out the poor by offering higher rentals, a law was passed which forbade any one individual to hold more than 310 acres. The law was the Lex Licinia, and that was passed in 366 BC, so a long time before the age of Tiberius Gracchus. However, for a while, this law restrained the greed of the rich and helped the poor, who were enabled to remain on the land which they had rented, so that each of them could occupy the allotment which had originally been granted. But after a time, the rich men in each neighbourhood, by using the names of fictitious tenants, contrived to transfer many of these holdings to themselves, and finally they openly took possession of the greater part of the land under their own names. The poor, when they found themselves forced off the land, became more and more unwilling to volunteer for military service, or even to raise a family." You know, that's the very fabric of Roman society starting to come apart at the seams there. Plutarch goes on, "The result was a rapid decline of the class of free smallholders all over Italy, their place being taken by gangs of foreign slaves, whom the rich employed to cultivate the estates from which they had driven off the free citizens. Scipio's friend, Gaius Lelius, attempted to reform this abuse," again just before the career of Tiberius Gracchus this is, "who took fright at the conflict which his programme seemed likely to arouse, and abandoned his efforts," i.e. the senatorial landowning class, just straight up intimidated him into stop doing what he was doing, and stop coming into the Senate and the Forum. Stay at home, otherwise you'll probably get yourself killed. That's sort of what happened to him. Plutarch doesn't say that explicitly, but that is what happened. And as a result of which he, this Gaius Lelius, was given the name the Wise or the Prudent, for the Latin word sapiens seems to be able to carry either meaning. Tiberius, on the other hand, this is our Tiberius Gracchus, went straight to the root of the matter as soon as he had been elected tribune. End quote. So Tiberius Gracchus wins his election to become a tribune of the people, and straight away, he seems to be sort of fairly politically fearless, because straight away, as Plutarch tells us, he just immediately starts suggesting laws, which a tribune didn't often do at all. So just straight off the bat, this new kid, the newbie, just starts messing with the senatorial order of things. Now you can imagine that ruffles feathers, because what he's doing really is what we might call populism. He's appealing to the people directly. He wants to take his laws straight to the popular assembly. He's not even going to ask the Senate what they think or want. He's going to take these popular laws straight to the people, get them passed, and the Senate will be completely bypassed. Well, you can imagine the powers that be, the rich and powerful men in the Senate, which are used to really controlling all policy, they're going to hate that. I mean, with a vengeance, hate that. And people immediately, and ever since, have always wondered what exactly Tiberius Gracchus's motivations were. Most people agree, both ancient and modern, that he was sort of on the level. In other words, he genuinely just wanted to try and reform the system for the best. It was for the best for the people.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.